Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day with climate justice activist Michaela Loach and founding director of climate change think tank E3G, Tom Burke. Good to see you both this evening. Now, the Prime Minister's loss of authority and potential loss of office is an open invitation to candidates to succeed him to seek support by abandoning his high-profile green policies. Now, I'm hoping you might recognise those words, Tom, because you wrote them. How big a problem would you say is the current political theatre for the green agenda now in the UK?
I think it's a real problem on two counts. One, because the Prime Minister has made it such a signature issue for him, then it becomes an obvious target, as I've said, for those people who want to succeed in him. But that creates an uncertainty which also undermines the willingness of investors to invest in driving us forward on the way to a clean and green society that we, I think, want to build. So it has two impacts really on us.
And Michaela, the PM's big showpiece, of course, was COP26 not so long ago in Glasgow. Once the world's media all packed up and went home, would you say it achieved anything other than what Greta Thunberg would call blah, blah, blah?
So I think that I can't say that COP achieved nothing at all, but I do think that it was more of a press conference for world governments to make themselves seem like they're doing more on climate than they actually are. And I think that we haven't actually seen kind of the ambition that was talked about by this government followed through afterwards. Boris Johnson might talk a lot about climate and say that it's a big priority, but actually in action, the UK government is still promoting fossil fuel production in the UK. It's still approving new oil fields in the UK, which is ridiculous. And also its tax regime actually is hugely beneficial for these oil companies. That actually means that the UK in the North Sea is the most profitable country in the world to extract oil and gas, which is completely not compatible with any sort of climate leadership. So I would be kind of cautious to make out that Boris Johnson is a great climate leader, given all of that.
Let's come back to the weakened political capital of the PM, if we may. There was a quote in that report from Steve Baker, Conservative MP. He says, "I genuinely believe that when the full costs of net zero start hitting us, if people have never been given a choice at the ballot box, we could end up with something bigger than the poll tax, certainly bigger than Brexit, because the numbers of people hit by it and their inability to cope will be huge." Is there a democratic deficit with all of this push to net zero, Tom, would you say?
No, there's not. And Steve Baker is, one, out of touch with what most people, and we've seen enormous amount of evidence, both directly in what people do and also in polling, that people want to get on with dealing with climate change. But also, this is a man who is opposed to green levies, but on Monday, he voted in favour of a green levy we haven't got and actually don't need in order to support nuclear power. So I'm not sure I'm going to use Steve Baker as an indicator of what the British public are going to want to do.
OK, your opinion coming through pretty loud and clear there, Tom. Michaela, we've got a pandemic to pay for. We were still paying for the financial crisis, and now we need to pay for net zero. Do we just need a mindset shift that the days of the UK as being a relatively low-tax country need to change?
Well, I think when we're talking about how much money we have for things like to pay for the pandemic or everything else, we need to also remember that the UK government has paid huge amounts of public money to oil and gas companies, to the same companies that are polluting so much and the same companies that are paying out their shareholders in billions. So since signing the Paris Agreement, the UK government has paid £400 billion of public money to Shell alone, and Shell in that same time has paid £45 billion to their shareholders. So actually, there's a huge amount of public money that's going in the wrong direction. It's promoting the polluters. And if we instead redirected those funds towards a just transition, towards funding net zero, so it's not being paid for by ordinary people, but instead by our funds that are meant for all of us and by the companies that are actually causing the most harm. So the companies that are causing harm shouldn't be being paid out loads of money in public payments. They should be taxed rightfully and fairly because they should be the ones funding this transition, not ordinary people.
A just transition, Tom, do you think that is anywhere on the government's agenda?
I'm not sure it's on the government's agenda at the moment. I was just going to say, Michaela is absolutely right. If the government had not abandoned green levies in in the Cameron years, we'd now be consumers in this country would now be saying about 2.5 billion less than they're currently paying. So it really is, as Michaela says, it's a question of who pays for this. And right now, there's an obvious answer. If you want to help with the immediate short-term problem caused by the gas prices, then what you could do is tax some of those very large profits, additional profits that are going to the oil and gas companies, and use that to increase universal benefit, as we did during the lockdown, to those people who are most disadvantaged, and create a real peace for just transition. But that's a thing that we'll have to see whether the government takes that opportunity or not.
Yeah, well, we're going to be debating this, aren't we, time and time again over the coming months. A bit of a, if you excuse the pun, a handbrake turn here. Motorsport and sustainability aren't two words you often see side by side, but its governing body is trying to change that. First Formula E, then Extreme E, and now the World Rally Championship has taken steps to reduce their carbon footprint with hybrid cars and sustainable fuel. Now, will progress to cleaner alternatives inspire its fans to make those sustainable changes? What do you reckon, Michaela? Is it a gimmick or a significant step?
So I think we need to be talking about climate in all sorts of spaces. I am not someone who watches motorsports, so I'm not as aware of kind of that whole sphere. But I think it's good that those conversations are happening and starting, because we can leapfrog from there to how do we actually make our transport systems more sustainable? So I think that rather than it being kind of about these techie solutions that maybe seem really exciting, it's about talking about like public transport as well, and like our public transportation systems, and making those greener, and also focusing on those rather than just individualized electric vehicles. Because we even saw earlier in the program people talking about their fears around having to buy things like electric cars that can seem expensive. Well, how about instead we have public transport that is affordable for everyone, is accessible for everyone, and that everyone can actually use, and focus on that more than the things that seem like flashy and expensive. But I mean, it's good that these kind of spaces that might not be normally climate spaces are starting these conversations, as it's a good way that we can talk about these other things.
Tom, has Michaela just hit it on the head there? And do we do too much fetishization of cars? And really, we should just be viewing them as a mode of transport, a utility, essentially. And only when we've had that mindset shift can we start to move towards net zero.
I think she has hit it on the head, and I think we shouldn't expect all change to be heroic. There are going to be marginal changes, and it's good to see the motor industry, and particularly the motor racing industry, saying that it has a part to play and it's making marginal change. Won't save the world on its own, but what I think is really interesting is it will get a whole lot of people who don't normally spend very much time talking about climate change talking about it, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, even we don't know much about cars, but we're talking about cars and sustainability. Michaela, final question about sustainable fuel. Why are we even talking about that? Shouldn't we just be talking about going from combustion engines to electric?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I think that there's a lot of time, I think there's this kind of, yeah, I guess you said before, fetishization of these like newer things and these heroic kind of seeming things, and this new tech. I think that it'd be great if we focused a lot on the things we already have now and making those practicable and allowing other people to access them, rather than focusing so much on these things that don't exist yet. But I think that there is also a space for us to be exploring as many solutions as possible, but remembering that we actually have loads of solutions right now that we could be implementing, and maybe thinking about how can we implement those solutions rather than just looking else for other places.
OK, well, we could go on all evening, but I do need to draw it to a close there as we're out of time. But Michaela Loach, Tom Burke, always good to speak to you. Thank you very much for joining us on Sky News this evening.
Thank you.
Now, before we go, remember, you can still download Climate Cast wherever you get your podcasts. This week, Caterina Vitozzi is in Manchester, where plans to tackle air pollution have become unstuck. That's after a local backlash from local businesses who say it'll be them who has to pay for it all. Now, thank you for watching the Daily Climate Show. Hope to see you next time.